All right, so today I wanted to talk about planting warm season crops for the fall. And one of the reasons why I think this is an important topic because it's often something that's missed by most gardeners. Most gardeners don't realize there is that opportunity to plant those warm season crops twice. And even if they do, they don't realize the vastness of how many things you can plant a second time. Most people by now are really focused on the cool season crops coming up, or they are focused on maybe a couple warm season crops. And when it comes to gardening, to be honest, like most people are most passionate about growing things that grow in the spring. You know, they're passionate about growing tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, beans, all the things that like really kick off the garden season. And less people are thrilled about growing greens and cabbages and things like that. But we have a great opportunity because of where we live, and the zone we live in, and specifically the microclimate that we have, to where we can plant virtually everything twice, and we can get an extended season and have the ability to extend our production and prolong our harvest. So it's a great way to, if we have failures in the spring, we can still have some successes and learn from those failures in the same year and get a second chance. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Kind of a little bit about timing, about just some of the common things that can happen, and some of the differences from spring to fall when we're planting some of the same things. Starting now up until about middle of August is whenever we can really throw in like those really loved crops like peppers and tomatoes, the two things that almost everybody plants. Last week we did the workshop on seed starting in anticipation of being able to put out some transplants in August for peppers and tomatoes. But it all comes down to timing. So we have that opportunity of we're cruising through the summer, we're getting towards the latter half of the warm season, and it's a great time to get things established and started. We're also going to have the ability to get our soil prepped for those fall crops ahead of time, all while still utilizing those inputs. Zone 9A always offers that second chance for the warm season crops, just because if we want to get down to it, we only have 3 seasons here. We have our cool season, which kind of goes to the end of the year to the beginning of the year, so that like November to probably more along the lines of December to February is more of a cool season. We don't really have a cold season. And then we get our warm season, we get our hot season, and then we get our second warm season. So it's very, very unique. And I like to point that out because that helps you understand why and when you can plant certain things. A lot of like things that love really cold climates or climates that have that cold weather where they're not able to plant anything, we have that advantage. We don't have to deal with that. So our goal today is to kind of get an idea of what, when, and how to plant for a fall harvest on these warm crops. So why would we plant in late summer? Because we've got a long growing season. We still got plenty of time for a lot of things to make it all the way to harvest, and that's assuming that we pick the right varieties, which we'll talk a little bit about soon. If we're doing seeding, direct seeding of things like beans, cucumbers, and squash for another round, we've got the advantage of warm soil, so we can actually plant them earlier out, whereas whenever we're in the spring planting those same warm season crops, we have to be really selective about when we seed them into our beds or containers or gardens, because the soil temperatures are cooler, the weather's still fluctuating quite a bit, and sometimes it's harder to get germination, or we do get germination and the weather is still fluctuating and the young seedlings just aren't getting the right weather to be really happy, and then we have to start over multiple times. Here, we have less variables. We know we have heat, and we know we might have dry weather. We can provide 2 resources that can help with that. We can provide some shade naturally or artificially with a shade cloth to help reduce the temperature so that we can get our plants established for as the temperatures drop. And we always can provide water. We know rainwater is going to provide us a better result, but ideally we have watering set up in some fashion, whether it's hand watering or a watering system, so we can supplement as much or as little as needed. Warm season is going to give us fast germination of seeds. Fall weather, that's going to be coming up as we move into September, October. It's going to be really ideal for fruit set. The temperatures are moderate. They're going to be, 80s. Sometimes we might get into the 70s sometimes in there. It's still warm enough for fruit to set. And it's warm enough. It's not so warm enough to where we have excess stress on a plant. Right now, anything that you still have lingering on from the spring garden may or may not be struggling depending on where it's at. And that's just because it's hot. The sun is here. When people say you can grow something in full sun here is different than full sun even above I-10 or other places. So you have to take that microclimate into consideration. It's just extremely humid and hot here. And it's a little different than other places that do get as hot. Late summer plantings also give us the opportunity to maximize the space that we have and get more out of the space. So it doesn't really change anything. We have the same amount of space, but because we have those two warm seasons, we have the ability to get more production out of the same square footage and the same inputs. And a lot of people miss out on that. A lot of people miss out on spring things just by improper timing. That's why I wanted to talk about timing today coming up, because it's important. The season in the fall for those warm crops is much smaller than it is in spring to summer. We're growing into that warm season and it stays, but then it becomes too hot and too stressful for some things. Whereas here, the stress factor is lower, but once it gets too cool, the same thing happens. Fruit doesn't set on tomatoes, blooms stop coming on as abundantly. And some things just don't like cool temperatures, like cucumbers, eggplants. They hate windy conditions. They hate cool temperatures. So there's just some factors that shorten the season and make us be a little bit more intentional about what we choose to put in. So what can we plant? Truthfully, we can plant virtually anything that we planted in the spring if we time it correctly. So we can plant tomatoes. We specifically want to target early harvestable varieties. So when I did seed starting last week, I encourage people to look at the packet of seeds or look at the variety that they have and determine what the harvest time is. Every seed has a projected harvest time, whether it's a radish that's 30 days all the way to a tomato or an onion or something that can be 100 days, 120 days, knowing how much time is it going to take to get from start to finish. And because we know we only have a short window, we want to pick things that are going to ripen early and go to harvest early. We can replant peppers, eggplant, okra, and squash. If we're going to do those nightshade family items like peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant, we've got to start them 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time. 6 weeks usually pretty good now because it's warm. Things will germinate quickly like yours. There is a week and they're already up, which is awesome.
That was cool.
But we've got to get them ready ahead of time. They're not items that we can directly put out into the soil in the garden. Whereas things like squash, cucumbers, bush beans, peas, if you want to do peas, it's still warm enough to be able to hit those again. We can direct seed those into the garden. It's warm enough for them to germinate quickly and then make it through their life cycle. Couple other ones that could be done if timing is perfect. Some people that want to grow like greens, some people like Malabar spinach, which is not a true spinach. It's a climbing spinach. It's a little more bitter. We grew it like our first season in our new garden, and it was very, very, very prolific. One plant would have been enough for an army, and I let it go to seed, and I still, 3 years later, pick new seedlings out when the conditions are right. But it's slowly now, they're slowly not germinating anymore. But for years, we've been getting new sprouts come up. So it is one that can be a little tedious if it goes to seed. Yard long beans do really well. Kind of a green bean, but they're really long. Sometimes hard to find. And you can do melons again if you time it properly. Which melons and okra and maybe even southern peas, Depending on when you planted your first round, you might not have enough time to do a second round if you're utilizing the same space, because those are specifically, those are our hot weather crops. They're not our warm season crops. They're going to thrive in the heat, and I encourage people to target those specifically during that hot season, because they're going to thrive when everything else is going out. So you always have something to be growing during every season. We're actually utilizing eggplant. We don't eat eggplant. I don't care for it, but we always grow some so that we always have something growing in our beds. We're using our eggplant right now to help shade some of our pepper plants, using it as a trial to reduce the temperature a little bit, reduce the direct sun, so that maybe we can prolong our harvest, because eventually peppers, just like tomatoes, they're going to stop setting fruit. So that's one of the things we're experimenting. And I can tell you it has made a difference with water intake. We have a couple that get a lot of afternoon sun, and they're always wilty looking. They're kind of sad looking. They're still producing, and they're overall they're doing okay. And then I have one, it is now overshadowed by a 5-foot tall eggplant. It's massive. Sometimes I can't even see it, depending on how the leaves are situated in a day. But that plant, I hardly ever water compared to the other two. The other two, I'm almost giving it to them daily because they're giving me indication they need it. This one still looks happy, healthy. It's still producing some. So it's just interesting to see how you can use some of those things to maybe mimic some of your spring season crops. And it can also ways that you can succession plant different crops. So if I leave my eggplants, and let's say I was starting over with peppers, I could use those eggplants to hopefully maybe give some relief from the heat to new young seedlings as we move through August, whenever it's really stressful. So when do we want to plant? We want to transplant tomatoes and peppers and eggplant if we've seeded them after August 1st. If we want to get production by the end of the season. Now, eggplant, it could, like I said, it can stand more heat than the rest of its family. But so you could probably get away with planting those out earlier if you had started seeds during the summer. But if you were starting afresh, having them ready to a sizable age and size to go out after August 1st. If we're going to do replants of some of our other crops, like our direct sow crops, okra, squash, cucumber, beans, peas, those can happen really anytime between mid-July up and through August. Some things like beans are going to have a lot faster harvest time. They're going to go through their life cycle a little bit quicker than maybe some of the other things. We want a timeline by crop, making sure that we're grouping them together and we're putting them in based upon the season. We want everything to be done by October and November, because by then it's too cool. So looking at the exact varieties we're planting and choosing ones that can be completed during that time, and that we're planting at around mid-July to mid-August is kind of the target points. Does that make sense? All right. So before we get in there and we plant those things, we're in a season transition. So for some people, like myself, we still have crops in the ground. They're still growing. We have some things that never leave the garden space. And then we have other things that do. So we recently pulled out our tomatoes or cut them off at the base and made some space so that we can kind of begin to plan for whether we want to do another round of tomatoes or whether we want to do fall crops coming up and we're going to wait. But we're going through that preparation phase, and anytime we're removing things from a previous season or making room, we also want to take that time to prep the soil and make amendments. So one of the things that you'll commonly find if you're doing raised beds is that the soil level always shrinks. That's because the soil is being broken down. It becomes smaller and smaller over time. And we do need to add more nutrients and sometimes more volume back so that our bed isn't halfway full in a couple of years. So we like to top dress our beds with compost. We'll usually add a couple inches of compost Sometimes, depending on the season, when it's cooler, I might not need as much. I might do 1 inch, but I'll layer in some good quality compost. It could be a mixture because different composts have different nutrient sets and resources that you can put out. And then I'm also going to fertilize with a slow release organic fertilizer. We do organic because the goal is to promote a living soil, something that is microbially active. So we want fungi and bacteria, we want earthworms and other things in the soil that are going to help keep it loose, that are going to keep it alive and help create nutrition. Earthworms creating worm castings, those are nature's free resources. So we want to make sure that we're putting building blocks into the soil and not contaminating it with something that's synthetic or that might give us kind of what I like to call the Band-Aid effect, where we're getting some visually good results, but we're not really building a healthy soil for long-term success. So after we kind of put in some compost and fertilizer, if we're putting out transplants or seeding, we can potentially seed if we want. Put out those transplants, have them available, get our spaces filled or our new layout, and then we're going to come back in and we want to mulch. Mulch is vitally important, especially in the summer months, because we've got to retain our moisture. That's one of our biggest enemies this time of year. Is we're either going to be a ton of rain like today out of nowhere, or we're actually just going to have no rain, or we could be moving into a drought season in August. So we want to make sure that we put things in there that can help us keep that soil moisture abundant and also keep the soil temperature down. We want it to be warm, but we don't want it to be so hot that it dries out so quickly. You can achieve that by doing pine straw, which is you can find it free, in neighbor's yard or maybe in your own, or you can purchase it. It's inexpensive, or utilize a good quality shredded composted mulch. It's important to make sure when you put mulch into a garden setting that you're getting something that is shredded. You don't want like huge thick chunks of wood or organic matter, because that's going to cause it to take a really long time to break down, and that can also take away from the resources of the soil. They're working to break that down also, because that's their job, is to keep the soil going. It's kind of like in the forest, leaves and things fall. Like at our house, we don't really rake up the leaves, and we have lots of them. We blow them out to the yard, and I mulch them up with the mower, and over time they're broken down. It's organic matter. It's closing the circle. We're giving nutrition back to the soil. That happens naturally in the woods and forested areas. No one's out there taking care of it. The microbes and the soil life is actually taking care of that. Lastly, we want to make sure that we're very clear on our watering practices, especially if we're going to be putting seeds into a bed. We've got to make sure that we have adequate, consistent moisture. So we want to always use the practice of watering deeply and regularly, but we don't want to water too regularly. We want to water, it's kind of I kind of contradict myself here maybe. We want to water with an infrequent mindset. We want deep watering that's going to last and stay, instead of shallow watering that's going to last a very short amount of time. As the goal here is to water deeply and long so that roots grow deep and they spread out, they get thicker, stronger. That gives them a bigger area to be able to get nutrition, moisture, and the resources that they need. Whereas if we water a little bit every day, a lot of times the water's not going real deep into the soil, and so a plant's root system it might stay shallow because it's learning that what I need is here in this area. Whereas if the water is getting saturated deeply through, as the top dries out and there's still tons of moisture this way, the roots are going to reach for it. Over time they're going to grow and grab that resource. So what are some common things that we might encounter that can be problems when we're planting these things that we're accustomed to growing in the spring? First, we have heat and sun. We have intense heat depending on where we have our garden set up at, especially if we're getting afternoon sun, we've got to protect from sun scald. We've got to protect our moisture level, especially if we're putting seeds out, because we need them to be consistently damp for good germination. So we've got to consider, placement. If we know we're going to be getting a ton of excess sun, we need to water more frequently because it's drying out faster, making sure we're watering deep again. Or we can also kind of mimic a shady environment and provide some form of shade cloth. If I didn't have a shade cloth over my little makeshift greenhouse up at the front of the store, we would water probably 2 or 3 times a day on like small, like packed vegetables and flowers because it's just so hot. But having that shade cloth makes it to where I can get away with once a day and the moisture stays adequate all day long, even though it gets really hot. So we can artificially create shade and help us make things easier. Because we just got to make it to when we get moderate temperatures, and then things become so much simpler. Next common thing is insect problems. So because we're working in the most stressful time of the year, in my opinion, it's the hottest. So plants are stressed, we're stressed. Plants are going to use up a lot more resources. They're going to use up more water, more nutrition, more minerals, and things are going to break down faster because it's warm outside. So we oftentimes don't put enough resources in over the course of stressful times, and plants begin to be weakened. While they might sometimes look really good to us, we might start seeing pest pressure, and oftentimes that's an indicator that we might have an issue. Maybe something is not available that the plant needs, and it's causing the plant to be invisibly weakened, and it becomes a target for pests. Pests are looking for certain things. Almost all pests have a specific reason or a specific target of why they're going to be somewhere. While we're talking about vegetables today, a great example of like hot summer stress, we'll talk a little bit about like flowers. Like if you've ever grown a hibiscus tend to always get aphids or mealybugs in the summer or once a year or one season. And if you look, it always happens when it gets really hot and it starts to get drier. And that's because those plants are using up the resources that are available to them, and they become, in a sense, a weakened state, and they become susceptible for sap-sucking pests to come and target them. So at home, we've been playing with how that works and how pests target specific things or specific plants at specific times by avoiding pesticides, which is part of our goal as natural growers. Carrie has a hibiscus that she's had for 8 years, I think, somewhere along those lines. She got whenever she was a school teacher, and we always tend to get mealybugs or aphids on it. And in lieu of like jumping to spraying to it, we've started to just, when we see them, we start fertilizing, or we take a step back and we look at when's the last time I fertilized my soil with a slow release fertilizer. That's for the long game. It's not going to give me instant results. So if we haven't done it recently, we'll do it. But then we'll also start taking an opportunity to consider, have we given any supplementation? It's stress right now. So what do humans do whenever you get stressed? Most people kind of have a vice, or they do something to help relieve that stress. So one of the ways that we can do that with a plant is we can help provide extra nutrition, soluble, quick-acting nutrition. And that's where like liquid fertilizers come in. So something all-purpose like Microlife Ocean Harvest, it can kind of give you a boost. So we've been taking that and watering in that hibiscus, and we'll do it a couple times. And over time, we realize that naturally the pests go away. And we've yet to have to spray this thing in a couple years. And I'm not saying that's always a foolproof solution, but it just kind of goes to show you that like pests are indicators of things oftentimes happening in the environment or in our specific setting. And sometimes they're things we're doing. Sometimes they're just things that Mother Nature are throwing at us. Another common thing if you're growing tomatoes or peppers, blossom end rot, where the bottom begins to rot or blacken. That's from a calcium deficiency typically, but that calcium deficiency comes from a lack or excess of water. So by controlling and being really objective about how we water and when we water, we can prevent that common issue that will also happen in the fall by regulating our water. When you have a calcium deficiency like that, oftentimes it's not because you don't have calcium, it's because you have too much water that might be washing it out of the available plant root zone. So the plant's just it's not there for it to absorb and get regularly. Or it could be too dry, we're not watering consistently enough, and it's just not absorbable. Biggest thing here, and this can also plague you in the spring, is having something that's taking too long to get to harvest. So because we know we have that shorter window, again, reiterating, we've got to have those shorter day harvest crops. So we want to target something like 60 to 75 days max on everything that's a warm season crop when we're doing it for a fall harvest. So during this time, we're going to want to fertilize regularly. We want to make sure, depending on what you're fertilizing with, if we were doing like a standard fertilizer, we might fertilize every 3 to 4 weeks. If I'm doing a slow release organic, I'm usually going to do that every 60 to 90 days. Always, because I'm fertilizing the soil, creating healthy soil, which can in turn help create a healthy plant. Then I'm also going to use my liquid fertilizers on a steady regimen, especially during the hotter, more stressful times. Every other week, often, I can either spray the foliage because minerals and nutrients can be absorbed through the leaves, or I can water in a plant and provide that nutrition through the root system. One trick, if you're going to water in some of your liquid fertilizers, you want to make sure that you pre-water the soil, because if you go into a situation you're going to provide a liquid fertilizer and the soil is kind of dry and you start pouring it in there, it's gonna move through quickly. It's gonna go down to the base. You want that soil to absorb up some and kind of swell up, and then add in your liquid fertilizer so that it kind of stays longer in the root zone and gives the plant a chance to actually be able to absorb it more evenly. We also want to make sure that we have our preparations ready as we're putting out these new crops. If we're doing things that are going to need to be staked, caged, we want to have those ready. Have those systems always ready ahead of time. I like to stake things when they're young, if possible, and continue to tie them up along the way. In the middle, tomato cages to me really aren't for tomatoes unless you're using like the really big square ones that are super sturdy, like the conical ones. Those are better suited most of the time for things like peppers, eggplants, things that don't get quite as big. Most of the time, your tomatoes are going to get so large that the standard tomato cage just isn't the most adequate way to support them. And two, oftentimes if you don't get them on there at just the right time or right at the beginning, you're never going to get it on there. That happened to us this year. We use square ones a lot of times in our beds, and I waited too long. And before it was all said and done, we had a tomato plant that was running all over the ground. When Carrie cut it off the other day, she cut off one limb and it was 6 foot tall, which is, so it was her height. And I ended up having to go at one point in time, and she had to help me. And I undid a tomato cage, a square one, and I laid it like a wall trellis. And I just laid it through there because it was breaking because some of the weight was on it. There was so much production on there. So that's a good indicator, and use my failures as a way to always be prepared. As things begin to grow in, it's also really important to continually harvest. Don't let the plant get overloaded. You want to harvest as things become ready, because if you don't, then that plant's still exerting resources to something that's already ready to harvest. And by removing it at the right time or regularly, then you're going to allow the plant to be able to produce more throughout that particular season. So expectations of how long and when we can harvest. Again, for most fall crops, and even if we're using those warm season crops into the fall, we've got to make sure we're using something 45 to 75 days. So definitely check your varieties. Never count on the fact that the variety you love the most is going to be the right one for the fall planting. Now, cool weather crops, as you move into fall planting, that's a little different. Most of those are going to do fine, even if they're over, 45 to 75 days. Sometimes some cabbages and things are longer than that. And that's okay, but those are suited for that time. But for warm season, 75 days is really what I would kind of use as my cutoff point. Because it doesn't seem like a long time, but it's 2.5 months and it flies by. Expect your harvest to begin mid to late September. And depending on what it is, it could go through November, depending on the climate, how the season goes. Because usually sometime in that realm, we could see in November, it's not uncommon for us to get a random light frost or a cold snap that just comes through. Sometimes it even happens earlier than that. You just never really know. So it's always good to have a plan. And that also, for me, stresses why we need like the shortest varieties to harvest that we can get, because we don't want to gamble on the weather. One of the ways for me it's important is to talk about having those systems for support. Also have something in the back of your head that you can use to cover them with. Use like a row cover, which is not really common for a raised bed garden setup nowadays, but something that you can cover them with to keep frost off them in the event that we start getting forecasted early for some kind of weather, and you're still in the middle of your season or you're getting close, things aren't quite ready, it's either we protect them or we might lose what we spent that time on. So systems to me are always important, and having those set out ahead of time. And that is my spiel for today.